Welcome back to Steady Badges Stories. I'm glad you're here. Whether you're settling in after a long shift, listening from your car somewhere on the Trans-Canada, or just looking for something real to hold on to tonight. If these stories find you at the right moment, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave a comment telling me where in Canada you're listening from. It genuinely means something to me. Tonight's story is about a woman who built a quiet life out of silence and careful forgetting, and about the night a wounded man in a trauma bay looked across a crowded room and called her by the only name she had ever truly earned. Halifax in November didn't forgive you for being unprepared. The harbor wind came off the Atlantic with a particular kind of authority, the sort that cut straight through a peacoat and reminded you, in case you had forgotten, that you were very small and the ocean was very large. Tara Cassidy had lived here for 4 years, and she had never once stopped appreciating that particular reminder. There was something honest about it, something that didn't require explanation. She worked the evening shift at Citadel Regional Trauma Centre, a gray concrete building 3 blocks from the waterfront, wedged between an older residential street and the slip road that fed the ambulance bay. It wasn't the most prestigious hospital in the province, and that was exactly why she had chosen it. Big enough to disappear into, small enough that a quiet woman in blue scrubs could go an entire week, without anyone looking at her long enough to see anything worth questioning. She had picked her apartment for its distance from the naval base and its proximity to 2 different bus lines, because old habits about exits and alternatives didn't really leave you. They just got quieter over time. She had picked Citadel Regional the same way she picked everything, by elimination. By what it was not, by what it would never ask of her. For 4 years the camouflage had held. Dr. Ellison Carlisle was the kind of physician who believed that his voice carried more diagnostic weight than anyone else's stethoscope. He had graduated near the top of his class at Dalhousie Medical School, a fact he found occasion to mention roughly twice a week, and he had built a reputation at Citadel Regional on the particular confidence of a man who had never once been genuinely wrong in front of people powerful enough to matter. Nurses who corrected him found their shift requests mysteriously delayed. Nurses who agreed with him enthusiastically found themselves mentioned by name in department memos. Tara had understood his system within her first 2 weeks and had placed herself firmly in the category of agreeable silence. It cost her nothing she wasn't already paying. She was used to waiting. On the Tuesday evening when everything changed, Carlisle had already found 2 reasons to raise his voice at her before 6 o'clock. The first was a fluid order he had written incorrectly himself and blamed on her transcription. The second was a patient he claimed she had failed to monitor closely enough, despite the fact that she had flagged the same patient twice that afternoon in writing and been told to stop overcrowding the chart notes. She accepted both reprimands without argument, the way she had accepted rain and cold and the particular ache of standing for 12 hours on a floor that showed no mercy to anyone's knees. Arguing would have meant attention. Attention would have meant questions. And questions were the one thing Tara Cassidy could not afford in a building full of people who had no idea who she really was. She stood in the supply corridor for 30 seconds after the second reprimand, eyes closed, breathing slowly through her nose the way she had been taught in a context that had nothing to do with hospital corridors. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily. She opened her eyes, straightened her badge, and walked back out before anyone noticed she had been gone. By 9:40, the trauma bay had settled into its usual rhythm. A teenage boy with a fractured collarbone from a hockey fall. A woman in her 60s with a blood pressure reading that had frightened her GP enough to send her in. The quiet choreography of emergencies that were serious to the people experiencing them and entirely routine to everyone else. The radio crackled at 9:52. Incoming gunshot wound, left thigh, arterial involvement suspected, patient ID restricted, federal transport, ETA 6 minutes. The charge nurse began assigning positions. Carlisle straightened his shoulders and moved to the center of the incoming bay, already rehearsing the version of tonight where he was the one who mattered. Tara took her usual place at the periphery, quiet and ready and unnoticed, the way she always was. Outside, the November rain was coming sideways off the harbor. She could hear it against the ambulance bay windows, a sound like static, like background noise that had been running her entire life. The rig came in fast. The doors opened before the vehicle had fully stopped. She registered that immediately, the way you registered anything that told you the situation inside had already deteriorated during transport. 2 paramedics, moving with the deliberate urgency of people who understood what they were carrying. Behind them, a man in plain civilian clothes stepped out of the escort vehicle and scanned the bay entrance with eyes that did not move the way civilian eyes moved. He was watching exits. He was counting bodies. The patient on the gurney was a man in his early 60s, gray-haired, a field dressing on his left thigh that had been applied with obvious skill and was soaked through anyway. His face was the color of old paper. His breathing was controlled, but barely. The kind of control that costs enormous effort and can collapse without warning. He was wearing a Royal Canadian Navy utility shirt under the jacket that had been cut open. Carlyle stepped forward immediately, calling out an assessment that sounded authoritative and was, Tara could already see, wrong in at least one material way. Then the patient's eyes opened. They were dark and very still, and they swept the room with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades cataloging threat and safety before committing to either. They moved past Carlyle. They moved past the paramedics. They found Tara in the corner of the bay, standing quietly beside the supply tray with her hands loose at her sides. His right hand came up. Not far, he didn't have the strength for far, but enough. One finger, extended and absolutely certain, pointed directly at her. WRAITH. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the way voices carry when they are used to being obeyed. I need WRAITH. The word hit the trauma bay like a stone dropped into still water. Carlyle stopped mid-sentence. The man from the escort vehicle turned his head toward Tara, with a speed that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. 4 years of careful quiet collapsed in the space of a single breath. She knew that voice. She had heard it once, in a situation that did not exist in any official record, in a place that wasn't on any map handed to civilians. Vice-Admiral Stuart Farrow, then a Commodore, who had watched a 26-year-old operator pack a wound in the dark with hands that had never done it before, and had simply nodded once instead of asking questions. That nod had meant more to her than any commendation she had ever been given afterward. She didn't dwell on it, because she had already looked at his thigh and understood exactly what Carlyle had not. The field dressing had bought time. It had not stopped the bleed, and his blood pressure, visible on the monitor the paramedics had brought in, was descending into a range that told her they had perhaps 3 minutes before his body made a decision nobody in that room could reverse. Tourniquet is placed too low, she said. Her voice came out level and clear, from a part of her she had kept behind glass for 4 years. It's not catching the femoral. He needs a high and tight, proximal to the groin right now, or he goes into hemorrhagic shock before anyone has a chance to do anything else. Carlyle turned toward her with an expression that moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere near outrage. He opened his mouth. The man from the escort vehicle said 2 words. Let her. His name was Briggs. He said it the way men said things they didn't need to repeat. Carlyle's mouth closed. Tara moved to the gurney with the unhurried speed of someone who had done this, or something very much like it, more times than she cared to put a number to. Her hands found the anatomy by memory. High, proximal, the crease of the hip above the field dressing. She adjusted the tourniquet with 2 firm movements, set the pressure correctly, and watched the pooling blood at the dressing site slow, then stop. The monitor's alarm began to quiet. Farrow's blood pressure held. The room was very still. Then Briggs said quietly, to no one in particular, those hands have done that before. There is a reason military medicine teaches tourniquet placement differently than most civilian trauma protocols. In the field, an injury to the femoral artery, the major vessel running through the upper thigh, can cause a patient to lose a lethal volume of blood in under 3 minutes. Standard civilian training places a tourniquet several centimeters above a wound. Combat medicine teaches something different. When arterial involvement is suspected in the upper thigh, the tourniquet must be placed as high and as close to the groin as anatomically possible, closing off all potential vessel space above the source of the bleed. This is called a high and tight application. The difference between a correctly placed high and tight and an incorrectly placed tourniquet can be measured in minutes, which, in hemorrhagic shock, is another way of saying it can be measured in lives. Programs like Stop the Bleed, taught across Canada in schools, workplaces, and community centers, exist precisely to bring this knowledge into civilian hands. You do not need to have served to learn how to hold a wound closed long enough for help to arrive. Anyone willing to learn carries more power in their hands than they know. By midnight, word had moved through Citadel Regional the way word always moved through a hospital: fast, imprecise in its details, and essentially correct in its conclusion. A nurse from the evening shift had done something in the trauma bay that nobody quite had the vocabulary to describe accurately. The hospital administrator, a compact and image-conscious man named Dr. Whitmore, arrived at Tara's workstation at 11:30, with the expression of a man who had been woken from a sound sleep and had not yet found a strategy. Nurse Cassidy, he said, his tone landing somewhere between formal and uncertain. I've been informed that you performed an intervention tonight without a physician's order, outside your documented scope of practice. Pending review, I'm placing you on temporary suspension from clinical duties. Tara met his eyes without flinching, something she had not allowed herself to do with any administrator in 4 years. He was in femoral hemorrhage, she said. His tourniquet wasn't controlling the bleed. If I had waited for a written order, he would have arrested before anyone finished signing it. Whitmore glanced toward the attorney who had materialized at his shoulder. That determination wasn't yours to make. It was the only determination available, she answered. And I made it. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable for everyone in the room except her. Before Whitmore could continue, Briggs stepped into the hallway. He was not a large man, but he occupied space the way men occupied space when they had spent their lives in rooms where the wrong posture carried real consequences. He looked at Whitmore without deference or aggression, simply with the complete attention of someone who had not come here to be delayed. With respect, he said, that woman just kept Vice-Admiral Farrow from dying on your trauma bay floor. I'd suggest your hospital's next priority be whoever put a round in his leg and how they knew exactly which road his transport was taking. Because whoever sent those people may already know where he ended up tonight. Whitmore's composure, which had been precarious from the moment he'd walked in, did not survive that sentence. He excused himself. He reinstated Tara before the morning shift began. The threat came differently than she expected, not through the ambulance bay, not through a window. A woman in a gray quilted jacket approached the nursing station at 2:15 in the morning and asked, in a pleasant and unhurried voice, whether a patient transferred under federal escort had been admitted that evening. Amara, the second-year resident who had been at the station when Tara walked past, started to pull up the intake screen. Tara was beside her in 4 steps. She placed herself between the woman and the terminal, with a body position that read as casual to anyone not trained to read it otherwise. She asked about visiting hours. The woman answered smoothly, her eyes moving once toward the corridor behind Tara before she offered a polite apology about the late hour and walked back through the sliding doors into the rain. Tara watched her go. If anyone asks about a federal transport patient tonight, she said to Amara, keeping her voice even, you call security immediately, and you don't look anything up. Understood? Amara nodded. Her expression was wide and attentive and not fully comprehending but entirely willing to trust. It was, Tara thought, the same willingness she had once been given in a far darker situation, by someone who had no reason to extend it to her at all. The memory of that compound, that dark, that single nod, it had never fully left her. She understood now that it was not supposed to. Briggs confirmed that the woman's description matched a secondary figure they had been tracking. Federal support arrived within the hour. The corridor stayed quiet, not because nothing was attempted, but because Tara had spent 4 years walking the same hallways without anyone watching, and she knew every service door, every junction, every place where a person could be redirected without ever realizing it had happened. Farrow was sitting upright when she came to see him the following morning, still pale, still careful in his movements, but alert in the way of a man accustomed to assessing situations before he allowed himself to be assessed. You made yourself very hard to find, he said. That was the intention, she answered. He studied her for a moment the same way he had studied her once across a dust-choked compound, in conditions she did not permit herself to revisit in detail. Recognition, respect, the understanding shared by people who have survived the same particular kind of work. I never stopped wondering what happened to you, he said. After you left, there were people who asked. There were reasons I couldn't give them an answer. Personal ones. Yes. He nodded slowly and did not press further. Men who had spent careers in operational work knew when a question had reached the edge of what was safe to answer, and they respected the line without requiring explanation. You could have let the bleed go, he said finally. Last night, nobody in that room would have known what you knew. You could have stayed exactly where you were. I know. Why didn't you? Tara thought about it honestly, the way she hadn't allowed herself to think about very much for a very long time. I spent 4 years convincing myself that stepping back was the same as being safe, she said. Last night was the first time I actually understood they were never the same thing at all. Stepping back was just stepping back. It didn't protect anyone. It only made me quieter. Farrow reached out and pressed her hand once, briefly, the way people did when the words available were not quite adequate to the moment, and a gesture was more honest anyway. There's a training program, he said. Joint Civilian-Military Trauma Response. They're trying to close the gap between field medicine and emergency nursing, what a combat medic knows in the field versus what gets taught in a hospital, and why those two bodies of knowledge almost never talk to each other. He paused. It needs someone who has lived in both places, who understands why the gap exists and what it costs the people who fall into it. I'm not going back into the field, she said. This isn't the field. It's a classroom, a trauma bay, every emergency department willing to listen. He met her eyes. It's people like that young resident out there. Nurses and doctors who will someday be the only person standing between a patient and a tourniquet that isn't placed right. They deserve to know what you know. Tara was quiet for a long moment. Send me the details, she said. She meant it. That was the part that surprised her most. Carlyle, it turned out, could be a capable physician when his ego was not the first thing through the door. The review that followed did not end his career. What it did was introduce a new quality of quiet into his manner, a habit of asking rather than pronouncing, of pausing before he corrected, of listening to nurses the way he had previously only listened to people with matching credentials. It was not transformation. It was adjustment. Slow, unglamorous, and genuine. Whitmore wrote Tara a formal letter of commendation that she folded once and placed in a desk drawer without framing it. Amara returned 3 days later with a notebook full of questions about hemorrhage assessment. They sat at an empty nursing station for 20 minutes, Tara sketching vascular anatomy on the back of a supply form, explaining pressure and time and the particular cost of hesitation in language that was plain and specific, and treated Amara as someone capable of understanding it completely. Because she was. She came back the following week with more questions, and the week after that, and each time something shifted slightly in the way she carried herself in the bay. A steadiness that had not been there before, earned rather than assumed. Farrow was discharged 2 weeks later. He paused at the nursing station on his way out, unhurried despite the federal escort waiting in the bay, and shook Tara's hand in front of the morning shift. "You were never invisible," he told her quietly. "You were just the only one in the room who knew where to look." The sliding doors closed behind him. The harbor wind, which had been audible through the bay entrance all morning, went still for just a moment. Then the ordinary sounds of Citadel Regional resumed around her. Monitors, a phone at the front desk, the soft percussion of a shift settling into its work. Tara Cassidy stood in the same corridor where she had spent 4 years becoming part of the background. She straightened the badge on her scrubs, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward the trauma bay. Not because anyone was watching. Because it was exactly where she was supposed to be. Thank you so much for spending this time with Steady Badge's stories. If tonight's story stayed with you, if there was a line that landed somewhere you didn't expect, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from, which part of Tara's story hit hardest, and whether you think she made the right call. Hit that like button if these stories mean something to you, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are more of them waiting. Stories about people who were never quite what anyone assumed, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.